Hello. Welcome back to STM Narratives. Before we begin, please comment where you are watching from and the time. In a world where people often ignore the suffering of others, there are moments that shine through like beacons of hope. Moments when one act of kindness can change everything. This is a story of a young boy, full of innocence and compassion, who gave the last of his money to a man he barely knew. A man who had fallen on hard times and felt forgotten by society. What he didn't know was that someone was watching, and that single act of selflessness would reverberate in ways neither could have predicted. This is a tale of generosity, dignity, and the beauty of seeing beyond oneself. The city was alive with the hum of traffic and the constant shuffle of people, all in a hurry to get somewhere, doing their best to ignore the struggles of others. On a small corner near a busy intersection stood a man whose eyes, once sharp and proud, were now dulled by years of hardship and the burden of his own memories. His name was Harold, and he was a disabled veteran. Harold's life had taken a sharp turn after his military service. Once a soldier with a promising future, he had returned from war a broken man. His body, scarred and weak, could no longer do what it once had. And as the years passed, the bitterness of being forgotten by the very country he had fought for ate away at him, along with his health. His disability check wasn't enough to cover his rent, let alone food and medicine. So here he stood, his old military jacket a patchwork of fading colors, his cane tapping weakly on the cracked sidewalk, begging for a little change. His eyes, though tired, still held the remnants of the pride he once had. But the pride could not pay for his meal tonight. A few feet away, a young boy named Jimmy walked slowly down the sidewalk, his head down as he navigated through the crowds. Jimmy wasn't like the other kids his age. His joy came not from flashy gadgets or the latest trends but from the simple things in life. His heart was huge, always attuned to the needs of others, a characteristic his mother had nurtured in him since he could remember. Jimmy was a 13-year-old boy with big, kind eyes that seemed to see the world through a lens of empathy. He wasn't from a rich family. In fact, he and his mom lived in a small, modest apartment just on the outskirts of the city. Money was tight, and Jimmy knew it. But he also knew the value of giving what little you have. That day, as he made his way home from school, Jimmy noticed Harold. He saw the worn face of the veteran, the crumpled sign that said, "Anything helps." Jimmy's heart twisted in his chest. He had just enough money to buy himself a snack at the corner store, but something about Harold's weary eyes made him pause. Jimmy stopped, digging into his pocket. He felt the weight of the few crumpled bills in his hand. He had been saving for a new pair of sneakers, but something inside him told him that Harold needed the money more than he did. It wasn't a decision born of logic. It was instinct, a deep, pure sense of right. The boy approached Harold slowly. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the man and then at the money in his hand. Harold, too tired to speak, simply looked back at him with a weary gaze, as though he had already given up on hope. "Sir," Jimmy said, his voice barely a whisper, "I think you need this more than I do." Harold blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected kindness from anyone, least of all a young boy who was likely struggling to make ends meet himself. Jimmy pressed the crumpled bills into Harold's rough hand. "Please take it," he urged. "I'll be fine." For a moment, Harold simply stared at the money in his hand. His mind raced. No one had ever given him money without asking for something in return. And here was this boy, so young, so innocent, offering him his last bit of change. Tears welled up in Harold's eyes. He had lost count of the number of times he had been ignored, judged, or looked down upon. But this boy, Jimmy, he was different. Harold wasn't sure why, but he suddenly felt like he wasn't invisible anymore. "I don't know what to say," Harold muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Jimmy replied with a smile, turning away as though this was the most normal thing in the world. As Jimmy began walking away, he could feel a sense of warmth in his chest. It wasn't the usual satisfaction of helping out. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. He glanced back over his shoulder once more and saw Harold still standing there, looking at the money in his hand. But just as Jimmy rounded the corner, something extraordinary happened. Harold stood up straighter than he had in years. He adjusted the old military jacket he wore and looked up at the sky. For the first time in ages, he felt a sense of pride. Not in his past as a soldier, not in his war record, but in the pure kindness of a stranger. A boy, no less, who had given him what little he had. The tears that had formed in Harold's eyes began to fall. They weren't tears of self-pity, nor were they born out of despair. They were tears of gratitude. Harold felt an unfamiliar emotion swelling inside him. Hope. Unbeknownst to either of them, someone else had been watching the exchange from a distance. A man, tall and well-dressed, had been standing on the steps of a nearby building, his phone in hand. He had seen everything unfold. The boy's quiet generosity, the way Harold had accepted the gift, and the profound impact it had on the old veteran. The man was Gregory, a well-known philanthropist who ran several organizations that supported disabled veterans. But Gregory wasn't just about charity. He was about dignity, about restoring the humanity in people who had been discarded by society. And as he watched Jimmy walk away, he felt a rush of emotion. He hadn't been moved like this in years. Gregory wasn't someone who was easily impressed, but Jimmy's selflessness struck a chord in him. He had witnessed a small act of kindness that had the potential to change the course of someone's life. Gregory immediately took out his phone and began recording. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with it, but he knew he had to capture this moment. Harold stood in the same spot for several minutes, still holding the money in his hand. The crowds rushed by him, paying no attention to the veteran who had just been given a glimmer of hope by a young boy who had no reason to care. But Harold cared. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of life. He knew that his time on this earth was limited, but the kindness of that boy had made him feel seen again, alive again. He had been at rock bottom for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to feel connected to others. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, Harold turned and began walking down the street with a newfound sense of purpose. He had something to look forward to now, not just the next meal, but the reminder that kindness could still find its way into the darkest corners. The next day, Jimmy woke up to an unfamiliar sound outside his apartment door. A soft knock, followed by a gentle call of his name. He opened the door, confused at first, and then his eyes widened in surprise. Standing before him was Gregory, the philanthropist who had been watching the previous day. "Are you Jimmy?" Gregory asked, smiling warmly. "I just wanted to say thank you." Jimmy's confusion grew, but he nodded slowly. "For what?" "For being the reason a man found hope again. Your act of kindness changed a life yesterday, and I want to make sure you know how special that was." Gregory went on to explain how he had witnessed the interaction and how it had deeply moved him. He then handed Jimmy a check, enough money to cover a year's worth of tuition for the young boy to attend any school he chose. "Your heart is rare, Jimmy," Gregory said. "This is just a small way of saying thank you for restoring my faith in humanity." Jimmy stood there, stunned. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. I just gave him my last bit of change." Gregory chuckled. Sometimes, the smallest things can have the biggest impact. Jimmy's life changed that day, but it wasn't just because of the check. It was because he learned something profound. That kindness, no matter how small, can have far-reaching effects. And it wasn't just Jimmy's life that changed. Harold's life had been touched, and through him, a chain of events had been set in motion that no one could have predicted. In a world that often feels indifferent, it was the simple, selfless acts of people like Jimmy that reminded everyone that love and compassion still had a place. And for that, the world would be forever grateful. Thank you for watching. If you would like to see more stories like these, don't forget to subscribe.